June 14, 1962. West Berlin. The air hung thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and coffee in the cramped apartment on Kurfürstendamm, just 3 blocks from the wall that split the city like a scar. Sarah Brennan sat at the breakfast table, her fingers trembling as they traced the edge of a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. Across from her, David Brennan, her husband of 3 years, buttered toast with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. The morning light caught the gold of his wedding band. That ring, she now understood, was as much a lie as everything else. In her other hand, hidden beneath the table, Sarah clutched a folded piece of paper. On it, written in her own handwriting from 6 months prior, was a decryption she had completed of Soviet naval communications. Except the original Russian ciphertext had never existed. David had created it, fed it to her through channels that seemed legitimate. And she, brilliant Sarah Brennan, one of the National Security Agency's most promising cryptographers, had dutifully decoded fabricated Soviet messages for 2 years, never suspecting that the intelligence flowing through her hands was poison, carefully crafted to mislead American military planners about Soviet capabilities, troop movements, and intentions. The realization had come to her 3 nights ago, at 2 in the morning, when she couldn't sleep, and decided to cross-reference some of her older decryptions with newly acquired genuine Soviet traffic. The patterns didn't match. The linguistic fingerprints were wrong. Someone had been creating false ciphertext that mimicked Soviet encryption but contained deliberate strategic deceptions. And the only person with access to her workspace, her notes, her methods, was David. The man who made love to her, the man who held her when she cried about the pressure of her work, the man who was a KGB officer. Sarah looked up at him now, forcing her face into the same soft smile she'd worn every morning of their marriage. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. David smiled back, that warm, genuine smile that had made her fall in love with him at a diplomatic reception in 1959. "Good morning, darling. Sleep well." She nodded, taking a sip of the cold coffee to avoid speaking, because if she spoke too much, she might scream. She might lunge across the table and demand to know how he could do this. How he could betray not just his country, but her. How he could turn their marriage into an operational cover. But Sarah Brennan hadn't survived 3 years in the intelligence pressure cooker of Cold War Berlin by being impulsive. So instead, she smiled and began to plan. The listening post where Sarah worked was designated Station Teufelsberg, though the locals still called it by its old name, Devil's Mountain. Built on rubble from the war, the facility was a maze of antennas and concrete bunkers, where dozens of NSA cryptographers and signals intelligence specialists worked around the clock, intercepting Soviet and East German communications. Sarah's specialty was naval cipher systems, the complex codes used by Soviet submarine commanders and surface fleet officers. It was vital work. American military planners needed to know where Soviet vessels were positioned, especially now, in the summer of 1962, when tensions between Washington and Moscow had reached a fever pitch. Cuba was becoming a flashpoint. Rumors swirled about Soviet military advisors on the island. Some analysts whispered about missiles. Sarah's decryptions helped paint the picture of Soviet naval movements that might support or refute those rumors. Except her decryptions, she now knew, were lies. Carefully constructed lies that David had fed into the intelligence stream through her. On June 15th, Sarah arrived at Station Teufelsberg at 6 a.m., an hour before her shift began. The security officer, a weary Army sergeant named Phillips, barely glanced at her credentials. "Morning, Mrs. Brennan. Early start today." She nodded. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get a jump on the backlog." Phillips waved her through. The corridors of Station Teufelsberg were painted institutional green, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed incessantly. Sarah's workspace was in Section C, a room she shared with 3 other cryptographers. But at this hour, she was alone. She sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of ciphertext, decryption tables, and reference materials. Her hands moved automatically, pulling out files from the past 18 months. She needed to understand the full scope of what David had done. How many false decryptions had she produced? What strategic deceptions had she unwittingly helped the Soviets accomplish? The answer, as she worked through the files, made her feel physically ill. At least 40 separate decryptions over 2 years. False intelligence about Soviet submarine deployments in the Atlantic. Fabricated communication suggesting Soviet naval weakness in the Pacific. Invented messages indicating that Soviet commanders were poorly trained and demoralized. All of it designed to make American planners underestimate Soviet capabilities, and all of it bearing her signature, her analysis, her reputation for accuracy. Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The humming fluorescent lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. She had 2 choices. The first was obvious: go to her superior officer, Colonel Hartnett, and confess everything. Reveal that her husband was KGB, that she'd been compromised, that 2 years of her work was contaminated. It would mean the end of her career. She'd be investigated, interrogated, possibly charged with negligence or even treason if they decided she'd been complicit. David would be arrested, tried, likely executed or traded in a prisoner exchange. And the intelligence catastrophe would be immense. Every decision made based on her decryptions would need to be reevaluated. Military deployments, naval strategies, all of it thrown into question. The second choice was more dangerous, more insane. But as Sarah sat there in the green glow of the fluorescent lights, it was the only choice that made sense. She could become a triple agent. She could feed David false information, disguised as genuine decryptions, and turn the weapon he'd made of her back against the KGB. It would mean living a lie within a lie. It would mean continuing to share a bed with a man who had betrayed her. It would mean transforming every moment of intimacy into a calculated deception. But it would also mean control. Sarah Brennan had spent her entire life being underestimated. The youngest of 5 children in a Boston Irish family, she'd fought for every opportunity. Her brothers had gone to Harvard and Yale. She'd gone to Radcliffe, over her father's objections that college was wasted on girls. She'd graduated top of her class in mathematics. She'd been recruited by the NSA in 1957, one of only a handful of women in the cryptography division. And she'd proven herself, again and again, as brilliant and dedicated as any of her male colleagues. Now, David had tried to use that brilliance against her country. He'd underestimated her, assumed she'd never noticed the deception. Assumed she was too in love, too trusting, too naive to see through his operation. He was wrong. Sarah pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, not a confession, a plan. That evening, Sarah returned to the apartment on Kurfürstendamm at her usual time, 6:30 p.m. David was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The smell of roasting chicken filled the small space. He looked up as she entered, his face brightening. "There she is. How was your day?" Sarah set down her bag and moved to him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against his back. The gesture felt like touching ice. Exhausting, she murmured. We're drowning in traffic from the Baltic Fleet. Hartnett is pushing everyone for faster turnaround. She felt David's body tense slightly. Anything interesting? This was how it worked, she realized. These casual conversations. David fishing for information, disguised as a concerned husband asking about his wife's stressful job. She'd told him so much over the years, never imagining that every detail was being reported to Moscow Center. Not really, Sarah lied smoothly. Mostly routine communications, training exercises, supply requisitions. Boring stuff. She felt him relax. Good, you work too hard. They ate dinner together talking about mundane things, a letter from Sarah's mother, plans to see a film on the weekend, the neighbor's noisy dog, all of it perfectly normal. Perfectly false. After dinner, as they sat on the small sofa, David's arm around her shoulders, Sarah made her first move. She sighed, a sound of frustration. "What's wrong?" David asked. Sarah hesitated, as if deciding whether to share something. Then she said, "There's a new batch of ciphertext that came in today. Different encryption pattern, more complex. Hartnett assigned it to me specifically because of my track record." David's fingers, which had been absently stroking her shoulder, stilled for just a fraction of a second. "Oh, what kind of traffic?" Sarah shook her head. "I shouldn't talk about it. You know the rules." David laughed softly. "Darling, we're married. And I have clearance for my own work at the consulate. You're not breaking any rules." The consulate. David's cover job was as a low-level administrative officer at the American consulate in West Berlin. It gave him legitimate access to certain classified information and explained his presence in the city. Sarah had never questioned it. Why would she? She leaned into him, playing the role of the exhausted wife seeking comfort from her husband. "It's submarine communications," she said quietly. "But the encryption is different from anything I've seen before. More sophisticated. Hartnett thinks it might be a new Soviet cipher system. If I can crack it, it could be a major intelligence coup." She felt David's heartbeat accelerate against her back. "That's incredible, Sarah. I'm so proud of you." She smiled in the darkness of the room. "I'm not sure I can do it, though. It's so complex. I might need to take some of the work home, spend extra hours on it." David's arm tightened around her. "Of course, whatever you need." And there it was, permission, encouragement. David wanted her to bring classified material home, wanted her to work on it where he could access it, photograph it, pass it to his handlers. Sarah closed her eyes. The man holding her, the man she'd loved, was so eager for her to betray her country that he couldn't hide it. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah crafted her deception with the same meticulous care she brought to cryptography. She created false ciphertext, using her deep knowledge of Soviet encryption patterns to make it appear authentic. But the messages she embedded in the fake traffic were carefully designed lies. She invented communications about a new class of Soviet submarine with revolutionary silent propulsion technology. She fabricated messages suggesting that the Soviet Baltic Fleet was preparing for a major exercise that would bring dozens of vessels into the North Atlantic. She created false intelligence about Soviet naval commanders, expressing concerns about the readiness of their crews. All of it was designed to make the Soviets believe that their deception operation was working even better than they'd hoped. That Sarah was now decrypting genuine, highly sensitive traffic. And all of it was designed to mislead Soviet military planners in ways that would benefit American strategic interests. But the operational details were only part of Sarah's plan. The real deception was more personal. Every night, she brought her fake work home. She spread the papers across the dining table, frowning over them, occasionally asking David innocent-sounding questions that fed him exactly the information she wanted him to pass to Moscow. "How do you say this word in Russian?" she'd ask, pointing to a term she'd deliberately included in her fabricated decryptions. David would lean over, his hand on her shoulder, and translate, helpful, loving, traitorous. And Sarah would smile and thank him and return to her work, all while her mind raced with calculations about how the KGB would interpret this information, how they'd act on it, how she could stay 3 steps ahead. The breakfast table became a battlefield. Every morning, over coffee and toast, Sarah would mention some detail about her progress. "I think I'm close to cracking the new cipher system," she'd say. Or, "Hartnett is really pleased with my work on this. He says it's some of the most important intelligence we've gathered in months." And David would smile and encourage her and tell her how brilliant she was. And Sarah would smile back and feel something inside her die a little more, because this was the man she'd married, the man she'd imagined growing old with, the man she'd dreamed of having children with, and he was using her love as a weapon. So she used his betrayal as a weapon right back. By early July, Sarah's false intelligence was flowing through multiple channels. David was passing it to his KGB handlers. They were sending it to Moscow Center. And Moscow Center, believing they had a golden source inside the NSA, was acting on it. Sarah knew this because she had access to genuine Soviet communications, the real traffic that came through Station Teufelsberg. And she could see the Soviets responding to her fabricated intelligence. Submarine deployments shifting, naval exercises being planned, all based on the lies she was feeding them through David. It was working, but the strain was enormous. Sarah lost weight. She stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. Her colleagues at Station Teufelsberg noticed. "Are you okay, Mrs. Brennan?" asked Lieutenant Morrison, one of the other cryptographers. "You look exhausted." She forced a smile, just working hard. "Big project." Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Well, don't burn yourself out. We need you sharp. Sharp." Yes, she needed to stay sharp, because one mistake, one slip, and everything would collapse. David would realize she'd turned the tables on him. Or worse, her superiors would discover what she was doing and charge her with running an unauthorized operation. She was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and there was no safety net. On July 18th, everything changed. Sarah was at Station Teufelsberg, working through a batch of genuine Soviet naval traffic, when she decrypted a message that made her blood run cold. It was from a KGB officer in East Berlin to Moscow Center. The message referenced an American cryptographer, female, married to one of their officers, who had been producing valuable intelligence for 2 years. But the message also contained a troubling note. "Recent intelligence from the source seems almost too good. Recommend increased surveillance to ensure source has not been compromised or turned." Sarah read the message 3 times, her hands shaking. They were suspicious. The KGB was starting to question whether her intelligence was genuine, which meant they were questioning David's handling of her, which meant David would be under pressure to prove she was still a reliable source, which meant he might do something desperate. Sarah left work early that day, claiming a headache. She took a circuitous route home, checking for surveillance, her training kicking in. She saw nothing obvious, but that meant little. The KGB was good. When she arrived at the apartment, David wasn't there. A note on the kitchen counter said he'd be late, a work obligation at the consulate. Sarah stood in the empty apartment, her mind racing. She had to assume the KGB was watching her now, watching them both. Which meant every move she made had to be perfect. She couldn't go to her superiors now. If the KGB was surveilling her, they'd see her enter a secure facility for an unscheduled meeting. They'd know she was confessing. And they'd pull David out before he could be arrested, leaving Sarah to face the consequences alone. No, she had to maintain the fiction, had to keep playing the role of the unwitting source, had to keep feeding them intelligence that seemed valuable but was actually poison. She had to wait for the right moment. Sarah was preparing dinner when David came home, 3 hours later than usual. He looked tense, his face drawn. "Rough day?" she asked, keeping her voice light. He nodded, loosening his tie. "Just bureaucratic nonsense. You know how it is." She didn't push. Instead, she served dinner and talked about her own day, carefully mentioning that she'd made a breakthrough on the cipher system she'd been working on. "Really?" David's attention sharpened. "What kind of breakthrough?" Sarah smiled, playing the excited wife. "I can't be sure yet, but I think I've identified the key structure. If I'm right, I'll be able to decrypt the entire batch of traffic by the end of the week. It could be huge, David. Proof of Soviet submarine capabilities that we've only guessed at until now." David reached across the table and took her hand. "That's wonderful, Sarah. I'm so proud of you." His hand was cold. That night, Sarah lay awake beside David, listening to his breathing. She knew what was happening. The KGB had pressured him, demanded proof that she was still productive, and David, desperate to protect his operation and probably his own life, had promised them something big, which meant he needed her to produce something big, which meant she had to give him exactly what he wanted, but on her terms. Over the next week, Sarah worked around the clock, both at Station Teufelsberg and at home. She created her masterpiece, a complete decryption of what appeared to be highly classified Soviet submarine communications, detailing the capabilities of a new class of nuclear submarine that was supposedly being deployed in the Atlantic. The intelligence was sensational. The submarines, according to Sarah's fabricated decryption, had a revolutionary propulsion system that made them nearly undetectable. They carried a new type of missile with twice the range of anything the Soviets had previously deployed, and they were being positioned off the American coast, ready to strike with minimal warning. It was exactly the kind of intelligence that would terrify American military planners. And it was exactly the kind of intelligence that would make the KGB believe their operation was succeeding beyond their wildest dreams. But it was also completely false. Sarah had designed every detail to mislead. The propulsion system she described was theoretically possible but practically unfeasible with current Soviet technology. The missiles she detailed would require materials the Soviets didn't have access to. The deployment patterns she outlined were strategically nonsensical. Any competent Soviet naval analyst would eventually realize the intelligence was fabricated. But by the time they figured it out, Sarah would have accomplished her real goal. She would have forced the KGB to reveal the full extent of their penetration of American intelligence. Because intelligence this sensational would have to be acted upon, the Soviets would have to respond, either by confirming the capabilities Sarah had described or by investigating why their own naval commanders were unaware of these supposed new submarines. Either way, the deception would unravel, and when it did, the KGB would have to pull David out, and that's when Sarah would make her move. On July 28th, Sarah brought her completed decryption home. She spread the papers across the dining table, her hands trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. David came home an hour later. He saw the papers and his eyes widened. "You finished it?" Sarah nodded, too tired to speak. David moved to the table, scanning the documents. His face went pale as he read. "Sarah, this is incredible." She managed a weak smile. "I think it's the most important work I've ever done. Hartnett is going to brief the Joint Chiefs. This could change everything." David pulled her into an embrace. She felt his heart pounding against her chest. "You're amazing," he whispered. "Absolutely amazing." Sarah closed her eyes, letting herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She'd turned her husband into a weapon against his own handlers. She'd transformed their marriage into an operational cover that served her purposes, not his. She'd become exactly what the Cold War demanded: a liar, a manipulator, a spy. That night, as David slept beside her, Sarah slipped out of bed and went to the window. Outside, West Berlin glittered in the darkness, an island of light surrounded by the communist East. Somewhere out there, David's KGB handlers were receiving the intelligence he'd passed them. Somewhere, analysts in Moscow were reading her fabricated decryptions and making decisions based on lies. And somewhere, the truth was waiting to emerge. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. She thought about the girl she'd been 3 years ago, the naive cryptographer who'd fallen in love with a charming diplomat at a reception. That girl was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone colder. Someone who understood that in the world of espionage, love was just another weapon, and intimacy was the deadliest cover of all. The next morning, August 1st, Sarah woke to find David already dressed, his face grave. "We need to talk," he said. Sarah sat up, her heart racing. "What's wrong?" David sat on the edge of the bed. His hands were shaking. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." She waited, her face carefully neutral. "I'm not who you think I am," David said quietly. "I'm not just a consulate officer I work for American intelligence. Counterintelligence specifically. And I need your help." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. "What?" David took her hands. "The KGB has been trying to recruit you for 2 years. They've been feeding you false ciphertext through compromised channels, trying to turn you into an unwitting source. We've known about it the whole time. I've been running a counter-operation, feeding them disinformation through you. Everything you've decrypted, everything you've told me, I've been passing to my handlers. We've been using you to mislead the Soviets." Sarah felt the room spin. Her carefully constructed plan, her weeks of deception, suddenly looked completely different. David was counterintelligence, had been running her as an unwitting asset. Or was this another lie, another layer of deception? She pulled her hands away from his. "I don't understand." David's face was anguished. "I know, I'm sorry, I never wanted to deceive you. But the operation was too important. We couldn't risk telling you. We needed your reactions to be genuine, your work to be authentic. The Soviets had to believe you were a real source." Sarah stood, moving away from him. Her mind was racing through possibilities. If David was telling the truth, then she'd been played by both sides. American counterintelligence had used her marriage as cover for a deception operation. But if David was lying, if this was a KGB tactic to test her loyalty, then she needed to play along. Either way, she was trapped. She turned to face him. "What do you need from me?" David stood. "The intelligence you decrypted last week about the new Soviet submarines. It's brilliant work, Sarah. My handlers want to push it through official channels, make sure it reaches the highest levels of Soviet command. But we need you to brief it personally to Colonel Hartnett. We need you to sell it as genuine." Sarah nodded slowly. "And if I do this, then we'll have accomplished one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of the Cold War," David said. will have fed the Soviets disinformation that will shape their naval strategy for years. And we'll have done it together. Sarah looked at her husband, the man she'd loved, the man she'd suspected of betrayal, the man who now claimed to be on her side. She had no way of knowing if he was telling the truth. No way of knowing if this was genuine or just another manipulation. But she knew one thing. She'd created intelligence designed to mislead the Soviets. And whether David was KGB or American counterintelligence, that intelligence was about to be used exactly as she'd intended. So she smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "I'll do it," she said. David's face flooded with relief. "Thank you, Sarah. I know this is a lot to process, but I promise when this is over I'll explain everything." Sarah nodded. But inside, she was already planning her next move. Because in the wilderness of mirrors that was Cold War espionage, trust was a luxury no one could afford. And love, real or fabricated, was always the deadliest weapon of all. 3 days later, Sarah Brennan stood in a secure briefing room at Station Teufelsberg, presenting her decryption to a room full of senior intelligence officers. Colonel Hartnett sat at the head of the table, his face grave as he listened to her analysis. Behind him, 2 men in civilian clothes took notes. Sarah didn't know if they were CIA, NSA, or something else entirely. She presented her findings with perfect confidence. The new Soviet submarine class, the advanced propulsion system, the missiles, the deployment patterns, all of it delivered with the authority of someone who believed every word. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Colonel Hartnett spoke. "Mrs. Brennan, if this intelligence is accurate, it represents a significant shift in the strategic balance. We'll need to brief the Joint Chiefs immediately." Sarah nodded. "I understand, sir." One of the civilian officers spoke up. "How confident are you in this decryption?" Sarah met his eyes. "As confident as I've ever been in any of my work, sir." It was the truth. She was absolutely confident. Confident that every word was a lie. Confident that the intelligence would mislead exactly as she'd intended. Confident that she'd turned herself into a weapon that cut both ways. The briefing ended. Sarah returned to her desk, and she waited. Because somewhere in Moscow or Langley or some safe house in Berlin, the truth was about to emerge. And when it did, Sarah Brennan would finally understand which side of the mirror she was really on. But until then, she'd keep playing her role. The brilliant cryptographer, the loyal wife, the unwitting asset or the cunning triple agent. In the end, it didn't matter which. Because in the Cold War, everyone was both hunter and prey. Everyone was both deceiver and deceived. And the only certainty was that love, in all its forms, was the perfect cover for betrayal.